So this last session is just looking at the great evidence that there is that Noah's flood actually took place. And what we're going to be looking at to show us that, in the rocks of the earth, give evidence of the flood, in the fossils that we find there. We're going to look at the flood stories around the world and shows how all sorts of nations and all sorts of places have this picture of a great flood at the beginning of their history. And we're also going to look at how the nations trace their origins back to Noah or one of his immediate descendants. Also, Noah's 16 grandsons. We can trace the historical veracity of all their names, all 16. We can see were historic figures. But first of all, some background. And the first thing is, well, was it a local flood? I know in a sense we looked at this morning, but let's just put those passages up that we looked at. This overwhelming statement in Genesis that all life died, all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle, of beasts, of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was a breath of life, of all that was in the dry land, died. And every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man, cattle, creeping things, fowls of the heaven. They were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. And we had also seen in earlier verses this important information that the depth of the flood was 15 cubits upwards above the mountains. And we saw why that was important. If the ark was 30 cubits in height, floating in the water, it would have a draft, as we call it, of 15 cubits, about 7 metres. And so God was here ensuring that the ark was safe in its journeys around the world. But how could high mountains be covered? It came to rest on Mount Ararat, which is just on the edge there of the Caspian Sea. And Mount Ararat is 5,000 metres high. But we have mountains over on this side, the Himalayas, where Mount Everest is 8,848 metres high. So how could those be covered? Well, I hinted that it seemed fairly evident that after the time of the flood, during the flood and after the flood, there were great changes taking place in the sea levels. Mountains rising, sea levels, seabeds dropping, altering the topography of the world. And it seems evident that that's the method that God used at creation. Because there's a psalm, Psalm 104, which speaks of creation in these words, talking about God who laid the foundations of the earth, that it should not be removed forever. Thou coverest it with a deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. At the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. They go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys, into the place which thou hast founded for them. So it seems to indicate that on day 3, when God was creating the dry land, it was through this very simple expediency of through volcanic action causing the land masses to rise, the water would run off, creating the valleys and forming the seas. And I think a very similar process happened in the time of the flood. We also looked at how all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were open, so that indicates to us some terrible catastrophe, geologically speaking, of the earth. Waters coming out from under the earth, and this water that was out into space coming down. Now, when we get to Genesis chapter 10, just 100 years further down the line, we have Eber bearing 2 sons, and he called one of them Peleg, which means division, because in his day the earth was divided. They'll say they were born about 100 years after the flood. So it is giving us a hint that just 100 years after the flood, there were still these big earth movements, and something fairly major must have taken place at that time, which was known as the earth being divided. This was a time when the sea levels dropped considerably, so that what were land masses, we'll look at the map in a moment, which joined everything together, they were broken because of the sea levels being changed. And as we remarked earlier, if the flood was only local, what was the purpose of building an ark, going to all that effort if they could just gone a few hundred miles and gone away from it? So let's look at the rocks of the earth. Now, the rocks of the earth, the main rocks on the earth, or not the main ones, 10%, only 10%, to rephrase it, only 10% of the rocks of the earth are sedimentary. Now, sedimentary rocks are rocks which are formed through water carrying material along. And you find boulders and pebbles and all sorts. And it is in the sedimentary rocks that we find the fossils. So of all the rocks on the earth, only 10% are sedimentary. And being very simplistic, just dividing into sedimentary and igneous volcanic rocks, the other 90% are igneous. And yet, at the surface of the earth, we find that 75% of the rocks of the earth on the surface of the earth are sedimentary. In fact, we can see that at one time there were 100% sedimentary on the surface of the earth, because the igneous have pushed up through the sedimentary and are lying on top of them, indicating that at one time the whole earth was covered in rocks which were formed through water. Strong water movement you need for sedimentary rocks to be formed. Now, as I said, within these sedimentary rocks we find the fossils. Fossils don't normally occur. When your pet dog or your pet cat or your pet goldfish dies, does it turn into a fossil? No, it just rots away, doesn't it? In the world of nature, if something gets killed on the side of the road, it isn't turned fossil, does it? Other animals come along, eat them, and that. Fossils point to some catastrophic occurrence, because you need pressure, you need heat to form a fossil. Don't need thousands of years. You can, with the right circumstance, form fossils very rapidly. But it needs pressure and it needs heat. And we believe that the flood is the only answer to how the fossils were formed. Because we've got the pressure, the weight of water, we've got the heat from the volcanic action, and we've got all these creatures being overwhelmed. And the fossils actually point to the fact that the creatures were alive when they were fossilised. See, you read in your books and you're told at school that an animal walks along, it dies, it falls into the mud, and over a period of time it turns into a fossil. It doesn't happen. The interesting thing is the fossils that we find are of creatures which were living when they were overwhelmed. They weren't creatures that had died, and we shall see the evidence for that in a moment. As we said, it doesn't normally occur. Fossils point to a catastrophe. And we get, they need to be buried very rapidly, otherwise it wouldn't happen. So we have, and again we shall look at the pictures in a moment, but even huge animals have suddenly been overwhelmed and covered in sediment, and heat, pressure turn them into fossils. And we also get what we call polystrate fossils, fossils of trees normally which go through many layers of strata. And again, we will see, well, the evolutionists really can't explain how that kind of happened. Now, something which I must admit I didn't realise until just over a week ago. I was doing a similar kind of talk in Leicester. The vast majority of fossils, 95% of the fossils that are found, are of marine invertebrates, in other words, no backbone. So fairly simple fossil, fairly simple life, but marine sea creatures. And yet we find their fossils on land, don't we? So think about that. And the rest of the fossils, mainly the rest of the fossils, are vertebrate fish. In other words, animals and human fossils are comparatively rare. The vast majority of fossils are of marine creatures. And in the bottom layer where there is life, which is called the Cambrian layer, where, according to the evolutionists, this is where life started, and then got more and more complex as we go higher up the layers. Yet in the Cambrian layer we find, and again we'll get to this in a moment, we find that life is extremely complex. There's no such thing as simple life. And in that bottom layer we find all the different families of animals and plants are all represented. We can all find specimens in the bottom layer, which doesn't make sense on evolutionary terms. And we can't find any new as we go higher. We don't find any new types of animals which aren't represented down in the bottom. And below the Cambrian layer we don't find any ancestors. Life just suddenly begins, and it's complex, and it's all there down at the bottom. And we have to say that if the fossils aren't a result of Noah's flood, then we have this phenomena that we have this worldwide flood, absolutely devastating, killing all life, and yet we've got no trace of it, unless we believe the fossils and the sedimentary rocks are the result of the of the flood. And the only thing we would then be left with are the stories of the flood around the world. But we find fossils of all sorts of things. Footprints, animal tracks, simple things like the leaves leaving an impression. Now leaves, we know, coming to autumn, a few weeks and they're all broken down. But no, these are perfectly good leaves, healthy, living leaves, suddenly have been turned into fossils. And silly things like raindrops and worm tracks, you can see fossilised remains of them. It's as if the flood has suddenly come along and overwhelmed these creatures. So we find this fish in the process of eating another fish. So obviously it was alive and having its dinner when suddenly some catastrophe came along and overwhelmed it. This ichthyosaur is in the process of giving birth. If we just magnify it up, you can see it's just in the process of giving birth. And suddenly, its life has come to an end. And this is one of the key reasons why I said fossils are of living creatures. These are mollusks, clams, all sorts of different ones, and they're always found with the shells closed. Now, the test of whether a shellfish is fresh is after it's been dead for a few hours, the shell opens. Now, we never find remains of this type of creature with shells open. They're all closed, showing they're all alive and suddenly overwhelmed and fossilised. And some creatures, you imagine some of these big dinosaur skeletons which have been found, what a lot of depth you've got to have to cover that. And it's all got to be done very rapidly. Otherwise, you'll get broken bones and all the rest of it. It's suddenly been overwhelmed with some terrible catastrophe. And then we have these things like the polystrate fossils. There's a tree trunk going up. Well, that chap's probably about 6 feet high, so it's evident that that's, about 4 metres high. And yet we're told that the strata is laid down incredibly slowly, according to the evolutionist. Their evolutionary Bible is the geological column. Now, the only place you'll find good examples of a geological column is going to be in your textbooks. Only 0.4% of the Earth's surface has all those different layers which are listed there. only 0.4% of the Earth's surface. In the vast majority of the Earth's surface, you have great chunks missing. You have topsy-turvy layers. Now, the evolutionary idea is that that represents 570 million years, and that is allegedly 136,000 metres thick. And by simple mathematics, that averages out at about 0.2 millimetres a year. Now, 0.2 millimetres a year isn't much. If I put a ruler there, so at 0.2 millimetres a year, it's going to take 50 years, according to evolutionary ideas, to build up a layer that's just a centimetre thick. And for us oldies, we still think in terms of inches, 125 years. So for a height of a person, it's going to take about 8,000 years to build up strata about 2 metre high. So we have a real problem when we have something like that. Do we imagine that tree was just standing there for 16,000 years, just waiting till the top part got covered? It wouldn't make sense. That has been covered in its depth very rapidly. That's the only explanation that one can fit. And so the flood explains why we have so much marine life in the fossils. Because these, the sea creatures, will be the first that would be overwhelmed and will be at the bottom of all the water that was there. The animals and man would be able to climb up to higher ground, and would explain why we don't find many fossils of animals and man. There are fossils of men, but not a lot of them found. But say the vast majority of marine life. And because in the Noah's flood there will be these tidal waves going round and round the earth, then yes, the fossils are spread upon the land, and not just, if evolution were correct and fossils were of creatures that had lived and died and then somehow turned into fossils, then we shouldn't expect to find fossils of marine creatures on the land. They should be just in the seas, but we find them on the land. And you can see, there's a fossil fish. We just turn it round, you can see there that it's built up, you can just see 3 layers there, but that's built up of many little small layers. And again, it doesn't make sense that if those are being built up at 0.2 millimetres a year, it's going to take ages to cover the depth of a fish. It would have been eaten and eroded. But dramatic overthrow with a lot of stuff coming along in the flood makes sense. If you look at the conventional time scale, that's supposed to be 4.6 billion years, and it's not until we get to the Cambrian layer there do we find life. And from the Cambrian and today is allegedly 570 million years ago. And yet, as I say, the problem is that life is supposed to be very simple there and get more and more and more complex until we come finally to man up this end here, but that's not what we find. So in the Cambrian layer, life is complex. There's nothing simple about anything there. We know there's no such thing as simple life, isn't there? Even the humblest bacteria is an incredibly complex creature. But there's nothing there that is simple. And the trilobites, which are the marker fossil of the Cambrian layer, we know that they were stunningly designed. They can grow quite large, up to 72 centimetres, 28 inches. And they have compound eyes made up between 100 and 15,000 different lenses in each eye. And the eye is so designed that it's made up of 2 different elements, minerals, and we're told, I mean I can't prove it, but we're told that that would give this trilobite undistorted vision underwater. So nothing simple about that, very complex. And we know that no fossils have been found which give us that link from one creature to another. In the Smithsonian Institute, they have 45 million fossils and a quarter of a million different creatures. And if evolution were true, we know that there should be millions of missing links. This is what Darwin was so desperately trying to find and couldn't find, but thought, well, given time, they will find them, but they still haven't found them. The missing links are still missing because they aren't missing, because they were never there in the first place. There are no undisputed links showing a change from one creature grown to another. And as I say, every one of the 26 animal phyla are all found in representatives in the Cambrian layer. Nothing before, no changes after. We find this sudden dramatic burst of life. Now, we believe that rapid changes do take place. And I just want to take you back 30 years to Mount St. Helens in America. In 1980, it blew its top. This is what the mountain looked like before 1980. That's what it looked like afterwards. The whole top was blown off. The power that they calculated in that explosion, volcanic blowing of the top off, was equivalent to 20,000 atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima. The power was 20,000 times greater than that. And what happened was the carving out, or the creation of new strata, creating valleys which were cut through with the rivers, the dams that burst. But this is described as a 40th scale of the Grand Canyon. There's 180 metres of strata there, which we know was laid down in a very short period of time, whereas conventional wisdom would say, well, there's 9 million worth of layers there. There's a person there, just to give you an idea of scale, that was laid down all in one day. 2 months later, all that was laid down in one day. About 2 years later, that was laid down in one day. So we don't need millions of years to create metres and metres of strata. The kind of conditions that one had in the explosion of Mount St. Helens and all the aftermath of that created new strata very, very rapidly. And perfectly good strata. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I'll say it formed what was is described as a 40th scale of the Grand Canyon. Now, the interesting thing is that strata, as we look around the world and look at rocks, we don't see evidence for long periods of time. On conventional wisdom, if we form a piece of rock there over a long period of time, we would expect that rock to weather. And because of differences in its density and that it would vary in the amount of weathering. And then would come along and some other event which causes another layer to sit on top of it. Maybe we have another one fairly rapidly after that, and then that weathers, and then we have another one sitting on that. And we should expect to see disconformity between the layers. But what we find is the layers seam smoothly. You go to Hunstanton, you look at the rocks there, and there's no evidence that, well, that batch was laid millions of years before that and there was weathering in between the layers. They just all seem to be laid one upon the other. Now, we can carry out real experiments in stratification, the laying down of sedimentary rocks. And it's rather surprising the results we get. You see, if we just diagrammatically look at that, we would say that, conventional thinking anyway, that layer X is much older than layer Y, and Z is the youngest rock sitting on the top. But we're going to show that the layers don't represent long periods of time. They merely represent differences in the type of sediment that is being laid down, and we show that they are all the same age. Now, what happens with strata when you do it in test conditions in a water flow, it grows sideways. So as the water flows this way, this will grow simultaneously. All three layers will carry on growing, but growing sideways instead of bottom one and then one on top and one below. So if we apply that to the flood, imagine the waters are rising and tidal waves are going around the world so that sediment is being laid down as the waters rise, and then the waters begin to recede. As they recede, they will then come down through this rock, which will be very soft and carve out, and rivers will cut their channels until finally, if that's the last one, or the last one, those would all be laid down in the flood year, and all the valleys and the hills, and that would be as a result of the water running off the earth, carving out these new valleys. And so, a very similar process as we saw in Mounts and Helens. Now, if you go onto YouTube and click on videos and just put experiments in stratification, or you can just put in stratification, though stratification is also a method of germinating seeds, and you'll get all sorts of red herrings there. But experiments in stratification, you'll see a video 35 minutes long, showing you live pictures of experiments with material, different grades of material in a water flow, and how it does grow sideways. So all the same age, the different layers. Quite interesting, quite interesting. So, what do the fossils point to? Do they point to evolution? Well, total absence of intermediate forms. Life is complex from the beginning, and we've really no mechanism for forming fossils. Whereas the flood, yes, we do have a catastrophe, worldwide one. Explains why the whole world is covered in sedimentary rocks, and from the description in Genesis of volcanic action, yes, that makes sense. We can see how they've protruded through the sedimentary layers. And creatures were buried alive, and yes, we find the fossils are of creatures which were once living, but have suddenly died. And we have the water, we have the heat, we have the pressure to form those fossils, and also we have the mechanism for stratification to form the rocks in which we find all these fossils. Now, again, evolution says, well, the Earth's millions of years old. Well, again, I want to query some of the assumptions that the evolutionists make. They say things haven't changed. And they use this long word, uniformitarianism. Sounds like a religion. It really is a religion of theirs. That we can observe today, and that will tell us what happened in the past, because things haven't changed. Well, if we believe the Bible, we know that the very foundation of evolutionary thinking and evolutionary dating is based upon a wrong surmise. Things did change. There was a flood. And the earth was underwater for over a year. Now, when they're trying to date fossils, they're trying to measure very small quantities of carbon-14 or whatever it is they're using. But if that specimen has been underwater for a year, it will have leached out a lot of the carbon-14, we take carbon-14. And so when we come to date it, it will appear a lot older, because water is a very good washer out of these things. And so if we believe there was a flood, and the earth was under water for a whole year, and we believe there was a change in climate, all these fundamentally change what they're trying to date. And also, we know the very simple fact, nothing to do with the flood, but the Earth's magnetic field is changing. It's changed measurably in that past 150 years. Now, if the Earth's magnetic field were stronger in the past, that would again greatly affect the half-life, which is what they're measuring with their dating processes. So if the magnetic field were stronger in the past, something that died 1,000 years ago, and you try to date it today, it would appear much, much older than it really is. Now, I'm not going to go into dating. It should have come on last Saturday, and some of you did. So the very basis is wrong. And then the other very basis that is wrong with evolution is that it says at the beginning there was nothing. We start with nothing, we start with a big bang, and then we have all these things. Now, we know that wasn't true. If God is the creator, then the earth was created with... Adam wasn't a day-old baby, was he? He was a youth, a young man. God says, I created the trees with fruit on them. Hens were laying eggs when they were created. If we'd been there on the seventh day of creation and looked around, we would have seen mature trees with fruits on, we would have seen mature animals, and we would have seen Adam and Eve as 18-year-olds or whatever. So at the beginning, wasn't nothing. The fish in the sea, there was salt already in the sea, God put it there. So we're not starting from nothing. Whereas the evolutionists are saying, well, we start from nothing. That's why they tend to get these very long ages, which are totally unjustified. It's all exaggerated because it didn't start with zero. Rocks were submerged for over a year. Conditions were different. Magnetic field was different. The atmospheric pressure was different. The oxygen levels, we know from looking at oxygen entrapped in amber, was different. So things were different. And that's what when they date coal, they don't normally bother to date coal because we know coal is millions of years old because it was, in strata which was millions of years old. But when they actually do, they get dates 33,000 years. In fact, you get dates much less than that. And again, I've got no problem with that because if I correct their dating to take into account the changes of the flood and being submerged, then that points to a young Earth. Mount St. Helens itself, all the lava that's come off, we use potassium argon to date that, and we get that took place 350,000 years ago. It took place in my lifetime and most of your lifetime. So we can see must be a fundamental flaw in their dating process. And again, this was something I only found out last week, that they found some wood which was in the Cambrian layer, which is supposed to be right at the bottom of the pile, millions of years ago. They date it only 4,000 years old. And here's another, I'm not even going to try and pronounce it because it wouldn't be right, but this in New Zealand's got lots of active volcanoes. And again, dating the lava flows, they get dates from 0.27 to 3.5 million years. And yet they're dating lava which we know either happened in 1949, 1953 or 1975, the three last times when it did it. So again, it points to a fundamental flaw in the dating processes. And interestingly, again, this is from the New Scientist. I know it's a bit old, but that doesn't matter. Again, they don't normally bother to date oil because we know it's millions of years old. But when they actually do, oil is dated at less than 4,300 years, and that's from the New Scientist itself. You see, they have a great problem. Again, I say, I'm not going to deal with C14, you'll be here or not. But theoretically, when a living creature dies, the C14 in its body reverts back over time, back to nitrogen-14. And because of the half-life, if that had been alive just a few 100,000 years, there shouldn't be any C14 in it. It should all have dissipated. And yet, in coal and in diamonds, which is formed from carbon, and in oil, is abundant C14. And this is a great puzzle to the evolutionists. How is it that this has remained in there? Well, it all points to the fact that it isn't very old. God created the earth, I believe, 6,000 years ago. So let's look at flood stories around the world. We have Babylonian accounts, we have tablets from Ebla, we have tablets from Nineveh, all talking about a flood. But in actual fact, there are flood stories around the world, about 200 flood traditions. And they're all over the world, in Europe, in Asia, in Australia, in the East Indies, in Melanesia, in Polynesia, South America, Central America, and East Africa. So scattered around the world, accounts of a flood. And common to all these flood stories, most of them have this recollection of a great flood which once covered the earth and destroyed all but a tiny few. And most of them involve building a great ark, and it was through the great ark that the animals and man were saved. Now, this isn't our John Morris, Brother John Morris from Cannock. This is Morris and Whitcomb, Genesis Flood Morris. But he collected all these stories from around the world and then created a table. A very interesting table. That's 50%. Right? So all these, over 50%. Was there a favoured family? Yes. The majority of accounts of the flood talked about a favoured family. Were they forewarned? Yes. Well over 60% talk about, yes, there was warning before it happened. Over 60% of them talk about the flood coming because of wickedness. Is catastrophe only a flood? Well, I wouldn't have phrased it like that, but what his meaning was, in a few accounts there was war and then flood, but the vast majority, this is the punishment, a flood. Was the flood global? Yes, nearly 90% of the accounts say it was a global flood. Is survival due to a boat? Yep. What's that, about 65%? Were animals saved? Yep. Did animals play any part? Yep. Survivors land on a mountain? Over 50% said that. Was the geography local? In other words, was it about landing in a particular location and from there they then spread out? So that's what that question was about, and yes, the majority do. Were birds sent out? Well, in about 40% talks about birds, and just in 10% talked about a rainbow and offering sacrifices, and specifically 8 persons. But that's truly remarkable. If the flood didn't take place, how can we account that? If the flood did take place, and from Noah and his family all the world was populated, well, it all makes sense, doesn't it? In my traditional history, there was a time when this earth was wiped out and we descended from the people in this ark. And the Chinese, they have, because they're a very ancient civilization, but they say the founder of the Chinese civilization escaped from the flood with his wife, 3 sons and 3 daughters. And furthermore, the evidence of the flood is embedded in their very letters that they use, the words that they use. We know the Chinese use pictograms. And the Chinese word for a boat is a vessel, container, 8 persons. So when a Chinese wants to write the word boat, vessel, 8 persons. Well, that can only have its origin in the flood, can't it? The Chinese word for tradition, to hand down, continuance, very similar. This is water, 8 persons. Because you see, Noah represented the bridge from life before and life to come. And so the Chinese word for tradition, to hand down, says water, 8 people. I haven't brought it, but I've got a book that goes through lots of different Chinese words and show how they have their origin in the Bible account. And even in little Fiji, they believe that 8 people were saved in a canoe, but fair enough, but 8 people being saved. And so the evidence of history many nations, European, British, around the world, trace their origins to people who Genesis chapter 10 says are descendants from Noah. Fascinating book. I could have brought some copies of this after the flood. Many nations have as their earliest starting point in history a name relating to Noah or his sons. That's fascinating, isn't it? Also, if we start with 3 families, 4,300 years ago, time of the flood, then we'll get the kind of population that we have today. If man had been on this earth just 20,000 years, the earth would be totally overcrowded. And isn't it interesting that today, through DNA, they have to admit, I didn't listen to it, but Andrew Marr's been doing a history, and he had to say, yes, we can trace all mankind back to a common Eve. They put in inverted commas. They won't go as far as to say Eve of the Bible, but back to a common Eve. So all families, living, all people on the earth, they can trace back to a common beginning, which supports the Bible. And it's interesting too, when we look at the history, civilization, I think the Roman and the Babylonian and then the Egyptian, that's it, isn't it? We can't go further and further back. It doesn't exist. Civilization is very new, really. So how about Noah's 16 grandsons? Every one of them, all listed in Genesis chapter 10, every one of them we can trace as being a historical being who gave their name either to a country or to a river, major river in a country, or to a place, town, city, or of gods of the people where they migrated. All 16 can historically be shown to be historical figures who gave their names to places and rivers and countries and that. So they existed. And so the migration of Noah's grandsons, 16 grandsons, would have populated the earth. Now, as I say, shortly after the flood, I believe that all these islands here were all linked up. And the land bridge across there would have been even bigger than it is now, and not so frozen as it is now. And it was in the changes that came after the flood, the continual rising of the mountains and the dropping of the valleys, would then begin to isolate these and form them into islands instead of having a common land bridge. And so we get the animals migrating, and then that's becoming a continent cut off, and so no fresh input of genetic input, and so you get specialisation. And that explains how from that central point there you can get to every part of the earth, providing the water level, the sea level was different for a while, and then, as I say, with the changes, they then became isolated. So, believing the Bible and the Genesis flood is a challenge, but it is also a warning to today. What we've considered runs so contrary to the theory of evolution. But the problem with evolution is it's a shifting sand. It's a house without decent foundations. How many times you read in the press, we have found the missing link which shows A to B. Great spread. And then about 6 months later, you'll see a little tiny bit like that just tucked away on the back page. And well, that wasn't the case. Or how many times have you read, these new findings will mean we'll have to completely rethink our ideas about X, Y, and Z. They're constantly changing. But the Bible account has stood test for all time, and I believe will remain true, because the Bible is a rock, and if we build our house upon that rock, we have a good, sure foundation. Evolution is a shifting sand. And it takes far more faith to believe in evolution, that chance, random mutations brought about this wonderful world, complex world that we have. It takes far more faith to believe that than to believe in a God who created. Now, any of you taking notes, I've just slotted that in this afternoon because you're delayed, so it's not on these handouts, but there are some very good websites, a lot of rubbish out on the internet, but Answers in Genesis and the Creation Ministry are the two main groups in this country. Both have their headquarters in Leicester. If you just go into Answers in Genesis or creation.com, you'll get all sorts of articles on that. The Creation Science Movement is the original one, started in 1932 in Portsmouth. And they send out, you pay £10 and you get their newsletter for 4 or 6 times a year. And that's brilliant. It has about 4 pages. Somebody goes through, the New Scientist, and pulls out all the articles which show just how ridiculous evolution is, and their own admittance. And this last one, creationrevolution.com, if you just go into there, every day you'll get about 4 or 5 different creation, evolution items, which I found fascinating. One word of warning: all these people will believe in a devil. Doesn't very often occur in what they're saying here. But they also believe that in the pre-existence of Jesus, and so you will get references to Jesus the Creator. But with those aside, they can provide you with lots of ammunition which you can use, because if you put the case for creation, you put the case for creation correctly, the evolutionists haven't got a leg to stand on. They cannot answer. Now, these things aren't discussed in this country, but in America, where there's much more open discussion, the many debates that are held, the creationists win every time. And much to the chagrin of the evolutionists, the Pew do a polling, I don't know how frequently, probably every 5 years, but one of the questions they ask Americans every 5 years is, do you believe in a recent creation within the past 10,000 years? And the number of Americans believing in a recent creation has stood as a constant figure for the last 30 years, hasn't changed. In other words, the evolutionists aren't making any headway in a country where the matter is debated. Well, we're nearly finished. So let's just finally look at these words of the Lord Jesus. He gave his warning that as in the days of Noah, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. In other words, we are to expect we will live in an age very similar to that of Noah. And we believe that we are in an age of violence, which was the characteristic of Noah's day, is the characteristic of today. And that without faith it's impossible to please God. We must believe that he is a rewarder of them that seek him. And this last one, by faith, Noah being warned of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. And that's the kind of faith that we must show. We've got abundant evidence that the Bible is true from the beginning. And we do live in Noah-like days. As I say, violence is the hallmark of today's world. And just as God's judgments came in the time of Noah, so we believe that God's judgments are going to come when the Lord Jesus comes. Time of great judgment, time of great trouble for the earth. And what we're saying is, are you willing to share Noah's faith, to put yourself on the right side, so that when the Lord Jesus comes, we can help him in the wonderful work of teaching the nations the truth of God. So we believe that Genesis is true. There is evidence for a worldwide flood, And this is God's challenge to you and a warning for society today. So thank you for that.